Okay, well, hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Bevis, and I am the Stewardship Wildlife Biologist with the Department of Natural Resources team. Work closely with WSU, Kevin and Brendan on various educational opportunities, et cetera, with a target audience of small forest landowners, but pretty much anybody working in forests in the state of Washington and Oregon, for that matter. And so today, I'm going to talk about dead wood, something that's near and dear to my heart. And we came up with this great title, A Dead Tree's Excellent Adventure. There's nothing bogus about dead wood, as a reference to the classic film from the 1980s, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So dead wood is excellent. We don't have a time-traveling phone booth for you today, but in reference to something that's just totally interesting and beyond the pale, I want to talk about that today. This is the program that I'm with, and we help people write stewardship plans, give technical advice. So there's our program. That's a little shout out to Matt Preventure, Julie Sackett, myself, and I already said that, but that's who we are, and you'll get some more contact information later. So here's what you're getting yourself into here, folks. So we're going to go through a little bit about forest dynamics, what's a tree, the life cycle of dead trees, the primary cavity excavators, the secondary species, down logs, and in the duff, a little bit about management, because I knew sooner or later somebody would say like, okay, but what about? And so we're going to touch on that. Then I'm going to tell you a little story that has a very snaggy ending to it that I think you're going to like. And as a feature, and I hope Scott Ranney is on here, you are going to hear the woodpecker song, King of the Trees, in the middle of the presentation. So not many other webinars will have an original song for you, but this one, yes, this one does. So here we go. Okay, so let's think about forest here for a minute. And I like the notion that forest happen like in slow motion. They seem static to us, but in reality, they're moving all the time. And it is, yes, it's way slower than us, but like that alder stand right there, that thing's only 35 years old. Notice the big snag here from a remnant of the old forest. This is about a 110-year-old second growth forest over at Miller Sylvania Park in Western Washington. Pretty good sized trees, canopy developing, hardwoods mixed in with the conifers. And here's about a 600 or 800-year-old forest out at the Quinault rainforest. Big gaps in it, big trees scattered around. And as these forests get to be mature, and this is true of dry forests too, you start to get some dead trees in there. You start to get some mortality over time. You know, a few of them fall over. And that's what happens, that forests are in motion and they're generating trees in all different parts of their life. So let's talk about trees for a minute. And everybody who's on here likes trees, I hope. But we always think of trees as being these happy little green, things that are solid and they're living and they're growing. And they're also three-dimensional features, and they change with time, as I've already indicated. And they change fairly dramatically, but in longer time periods than we're used to. And so a natural forest, when I say a natural forest being one that has had time to develop its character, has trees in lots of different ages. You know, it's often they're in cohorts, meaning the overstory will be within 10 or 20 years, but the understory will be of a different age group. And sometimes there'll be a few, way different than the others. And sometimes there'll be a big dead tree stuck in there, like this big Douglas fir snag with these pileated woodpecker excavations going all the way almost to my elbow into the middle of this big tree. And in these forests, you start to look at trees. And I think this is so interesting because every tree has a unique story, meaning it shows what happened to it. So like this grand fir on the left with this healed scar, probably from a fire, or a cedar with a crack going right up the side. So every tree has a unique story. Well, something about trees. We think of them as being these organisms, unto themselves, but they die, they stop being able to defend themselves regularly. And it's part of the whole dynamic of a developing forest. And so you might get a few die at a time, like from bugs or a fungus pocket or something, or you might get a whole bunch die at once, like from a fire is the classic. Or on the west side in particular, but we have this on the east side, you might have these slow motion mortality events. Root rot pockets are classic, where the tree declines, then a cluster of them die, and you'll have that little pocket. Or, like I said, all at once in a fire. That's from 2015. That picture was taken 2 years ago in the Methow from the Twist River fire. Or 1990, that's 30 years ago up near Sherman Pass outside of Republic, and look at all the snags. Anybody been to Yellowstone since 1988? There's a lot of standing dead trees out there. Or you might have a wind throw event. Say in a lot of Western Washington, wind throw events can be where a bunch of trees will die. And this was a microburst near Colville just a few years ago, where a whole bunch of trees were blasted in half from this like downdraft in the atmosphere. Anybody ever been out in the mountains and seen something like this when you're out hiking around? These old fire-scarred uh, trees, snags that are out there. Who knows how long those have been there? This one on the right is over near Stevens Pass. That's Howard, and he was very proud of this. Big fire scar in the middle of an old Douglas fir stem that could be like 300 years since it died. Been there a long time. So here's the point, that whatever the event, wind throw, fire, avalanche, root rot, would persist for a long time in the ecosystem. And this is a really important point about the development and a natural functioning of our forest in the Pacific Northwest. So, rhetorical question, what the heck is a tree? Well, a tree is not a what's the word, coherent organism like we are, where all of the parts are necessarily working together for the function of the tree at any given time. And here's kind of what I'm getting at. Pretty much everybody here has seen this diagram. Thank you there. Yes, good job, Brendan. A snag is a standing dead tree. Thank you. Assuming that's common language, but it's not. Okay, so here's a cross section of a tree, and the only part of the tree that has cell reproduction is the cambium. The cambium is reproducing both directions. Most of the tree is not living tissue. And I'm going to say this again, but the xylem, this part, love that word, xylem. Sounds like some kind of a musical instrument, is taking water and nutrients from the soil, there you go, up to the photosynthetic surface up above. The phloem, this part, the inner part, is moving photosynthate, meaning things generated in the leaves, down to the rest of the tree. The rest of it is some kind of non-living tissue that's supporting and keeping the whole thing going. There's resin in here, there's ducts, there's sap, there's all of these things going on. But most of a tree is actually dead tissue, meaning it's not living in the sense that it's doing metabolism and reproducing. Most of a tree is a series of some kind of a tube moving fluids up and down, or acting as support to hold up the photosynthetic surface in the above. And this is a really interesting little tidbit, that trees compartmentalize, meaning they can wall off areas of infection, kind of like we get a scab, and like continue to function. So like this cedar, before it was cut, here's the sapwood, that little wet part right around the outside. And the cambium was here, and the middle was dead wood, complete with all of this rot. And the tree is cranking along, doing its thing, you know. So a tree, as a living entity, has the ability to fend off invasions from fungus in particular, but fungus and insects are the two big enemies of trees. And a live tree is this marvelous organism with, you know, the roots out here and everything we were just talking about. But sometimes something goes wrong. Cambium clogs up, there's drought, the fire cooks it, whatever, the tree dies. Well, when a tree is fresh dead, the cambium is still there for a short time, and the twigs are there, and for a while the needles are there or the leaves are there. They fall off relatively quickly. And this transition from live to this happens pretty fast. The early phases in the life cycle of a dead tree, the cambium is still there. And when the cambium is where all the sugar is. It's kind of interesting because the availability of food in wood, cambium is where the sugar is, and boom, the bugs are in there right away. Excuse me. Sound check with Mr. Zobrist. Is it sound okay? Uh, okay. Somebody else just give me a thumbs up or whatever for.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Everything's sounding good to me as well.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so in the early phases of tree death, the cambium is almost immediately invaded by various insects. So when you see underwood these cool little channels, this is beetle tracks, and I can't remember which one, from eating the cambium. Well, these holes in the bark, that's a woodpecker, an apex predator going after these bugs. And this happens within, oh gosh, 5 years, let's say. No, usually shorter than that. And the cambium is gone. Now the whole thing is wood. And the bark shreds off eventually. It gets hard. Sometimes it breaks off. You know, you get a woodpecker cavity. This tree right here probably has been standing dead. This picture was taken about 3 or 4 years ago. Oh, that tree's been standing dead for 30, 40 years. This one's been dead for 70, 80 years. But it goes from a hard snag to a soft snag. This is an interesting graphic because this is an estimate of the age of a standing dead tree from the Quinault forest out there. And this is a wet habitat here, but look at the age here. So year 2, fine branches are still here. Year 6, breaking off. 15, this one, if it was lucky, broke off. 40, look at that. 100 years later, the thing is still standing. And this is over in the Quinault, and it's bloody wet over there. So long time. Falls over, becomes a log, lays there on the forest floor, starts to decay, breaks down. Various organisms live on these logs. I find it really, really interesting that the moss lives on the log. And look at, there's a difference right there. There's some kind of a plant. Somebody could tell me what that is. And on the log, it's a whole different set of organisms on wood. And those logs can also be a substrate for trees. If everybody likes nurse logs, is kind of a cool thing. And here's a little spruce tree growing out of a log over on the Olympic Peninsula. And again, the bracken fern, excuse me, not bracken fern, sword fern, not on the log, but down here on the ground. Same thing here. So the logs can be a particular substrate, continue to break down. They break into soil. They hold moisture. They go slowly. And I already said this, but it takes a long time. The presence of wood, even in a fire system, if a fire came through, it burns up the smaller stuff, the log is still there and it breaks down over a long period of time. So scientists have actually created some guidelines for describing decay conditions. And it's interesting because it's not very precise, only that it's very, very difficult to quantify the various stages of decay in a piece of wood. It's easy to say the tree is live and healthy, but then it gets a little subjective, but it's not totally subjective. So it is predictable. So this is kind of interesting that the decay cycle of a tree is something that's been studied enough to be predictable. Let's see. So there we go. Good. I see we're having some interesting discussions about slash over here on the right. Basically, small wood is a fire risk. Big wood is not. And so, yeah, the beetles and everything, I'm not going to touch on that a lot today because that's a really interesting, larger question that we can talk about. Okay, so back to the dead wood. Dead wood is essential to natural forest ecology. And this has only become a really, really clear thing in the past, say, 50 years, which is rather remarkable. For the longest time, the prevailing wisdom was you wanted to get this stuff out of there, to get your seedlings in the ground, you know, to grow another crop as quickly as possible, etc. And the ecological role of dead wood is just enormous. It's pretty amazing. So I got to mention, it's also great habitat. Oh my gosh, dead wood stuff is just some of the coolest wildlife there is. And I get a little excited about that. This is the excellent adventure because we're going to relate to some of these creatures now. So let me introduce you to a few of the dead wood associated wildlife species. But first, a sip of coffee. Okay. Yeah, good. You guys are going to talk about slash and deadwood. So let's introduce you to a few of these species. My favorite, probably the coolest bird in the world, the pileated woodpecker. I bet most people in here have seen one about the size of a crow, largest woodpecker in North America. Um, make these rectangular holes going deep into the wood after wood boring insects and carpenter ants. They are big. They're like the size of a crow, probably I don't know, 18, 20 inches. I bet longer than that. I'm holding my hands up. Can you see my hands? About that big. And they have really long flight distances between their home ranges. That's a male because of the mustache there, and the red goes all the way to his nose. This is right outside of my house just the other day, and I'll show you another picture of that. I was so excited. And look how sleek this thing is. This is just such a cool bird. They eat wood boring insects. And now you might ask, wait a second, Ken, how did you get that woodpecker to sit still by not Photoshop? And where the heck did you get a flat-headed borer? Well, I was splitting a piece of firewood and these borers fell out. And this is actually a taxidermied woodpecker that travels with me. So yes, and tidbit, Woody Woodpecker is modeled after the pileated woodpecker because the cartoonist was on his honeymoon in the Sierra Nevada and he heard this crazy big bird banging on the cabin and he created a cartoon character. So now you know Bert Lance, where Woody Woodpecker came from. This was just a few days ago. I planted this snag right on the edge of our yard. That's for my wife's dog agility. And right on top of this thing, one morning showed up Woody himself. It's a male landing on that snag, sitting right up here on top. And my lovely wife got these cool photographs of a pileated right out our window. We don't live right in a bunch of dense trees, but we see them crossing the Methow Valley here sometimes. Anyway, pileated woodpecker. A couple other cavity excavators include sapsuckers, the red nape sapsucker. There's the red-breasted sapsucker, the hairy woodpecker, which I kind of like hairy. Oh, Gary's good. Let's see. Okay, I'll get Kevin. Keep track of that question about woodpeckers there. Um, that about pileateds. I don't want to go off on a tangent on pileateds yet. So let's see. Hold that thought. Hairy woodpecker is kind of like every man's woodpecker, about the size of a robin, occur in most forest types. That's a female. Downy woodpeckers, the little version of the hairy, shorter beak, soft wood, very common in woodlands with a lot of hardwoods, red-breasted nuthatch, northern flickers, wick, 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 feed on the ground, make cavities in softwood. So there's about 14 different species of woodpeckers in Washington, and these are some associated with forest. Sometimes scientists study primary cavity excavators and deadwood ecology, and well, there's one right there. By golly, that's me. And I've never had a chance to actually I talk about this, but I did my master's thesis on woodpeckers and snags. I consider it a classic from the last century, 1994. And primary cavity excavator birds in managed and unmanaged grandiferous forest habitats of central Washington's East Cascades just rolls right off of the tongue, doesn't it? I think it would make a great movie. So Kevin, I think we need to work on that. And Brendan, I'm thinking you could play me because I'm getting old and frumpy. So there we go. Okay, anyway, hopefully somebody laughed at that. But I actually did my master's on snags and woodpeckers. So this fascination with deadwood has been going on a long time. And here we go. Let's see if this works. This is the woodpecker song. And I'm going to take my headset off, sit it right on the desk in front of me. And hopefully that will give a little bit better sound. So let's see if this works. It just fell on your head. Okay. Okay. Hit the chat box for me, Brendan, and tell me if this sounds okay. Start over. Sounds good. Okay, Kevin, thank you. A little quiet, but okay. All right. Hey, everybody. This, by the way, is a total experiment. Kevin thinks it sounds good. So sing along with me now. Oh, by the way, the song is biologically correct. I'm a woodpecker, the king of the trees. I got padded brains, I do as I please. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. I'm a crazy red hammer, I make cavities. Homes for you, homes for me. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. I climb up the tree, tapping, tappy, tap, listening for that insect cave. Now I find that hollow sound, I axe my way in, and I slip in my sticky, sticky tongue. Yum, I'm a woodpecker, the king of the trees. I got padded brains, I do as I please. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. I'm a crazy red hammer, I make cavities. Homes for you, homes for me. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. I got rhythm in my bones, I'm synchronized. I bang on the highest place I find. I play my licks, I whack my tricks, I bang on my tree drum. And sometimes I sing just for fun. Ha-da-da-ha-ha, ha-da-da-ha-ha, wicka, 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 hey, hey. I'm the king of the woods, rhythm break. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. I'm a woodpecker, the king of the trees. I got padded brains, I do as I please. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. I'm a crazy red hammer, I make cavities. Homes for you, homes for me. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. Thank you, Darren. It's peppy. I like that. Darren, enthusiastic clapping. Oh, wow, you could hear that. I am so tickled.
Very, very nice. Very nice. Hey, can we pause and do a few questions?
Sure, yes. This would be a fine question.
Of course we can. So there are a couple of related questions here. One is, I've had a woodpecker eat into a living cedar, like one of your pictures. Can they kill a tree? Referring to the pileated woodpecker. And then a similar question, are trees that acquire a lot of woodpecker holes doomed to die? Don't these wounds intro a lot of problems to the tree?
Generally no, because of that element of the heartwood. So a woodpecker going deep into the tree, if it's a big pileated hole, they're going into the middle, going after insects that are in the middle. And as long as the tree has enough structural integrity, in general, they'll keep going. I mean, how do you get a hollow tree? A hollow tree is essentially functioning on the outside with a hollow middle. Those are some of the very best trees for habitat. So no, in general, when you see woodpecker activity, they're predators going after insects that are in the tree for another reason. So if, for example, if bark beetles have overwhelmed a tree, what's the word? They've killed the tree or girdled the tree by way of cutting off the cambium, and the woodpeckers are going after the bug. So in general, the woodpeckers are more asymptomatic of the presence of the insects, and the deep excavations, like a tree with those big square holes, like a cedar, a live cedar with those big square holes, as long as it's got enough wood to send water up above, it's actually kind of back to that earlier commentary. The tree's functioning. So there you go.
And you could have a tree that has heart rot, for instance, and
Yes.
it's like Tootsie Pop, right? How many licks does it take to get to the center, and all that, hard outside, soft inside. But the heartwood doesn't function for sap transport anymore. It's just the outer ring of the sapwood, and cedars especially are resilient to injuries. And Ken, what about What about carpenter ants?
So carpenter ants are a presence in the middle of a tree with all that heart rot, and they're essentially responding to the fungus that has weakened the ringwood, and they create these amazing colonies inside of a tree. And carpenter ants are an excellent thing to have in your forest because they actually glean the canopy for defoliating insects and things. And so carpenter ants are opportunistic. You don't want them in your house. You do want them in your forest.
And typically they're going to go after wood that's already dead as opposed to chewing up live functioning wood.
Yes, yes, yes.
So another
Now, Kevin,
question.
go ahead.
I was told one time that there are a larger and a smaller subspecies of pileated woodpeckers. Is this true?
I don't think so. Sometimes there used to be the ivory bill, which is the one that's probably extinct in the southeast that was slightly bigger. But a pileated is pretty much, I've never heard of a subspecies. What can happen is you may actually see juveniles that are with the adult, and so sometimes you could mix it up, but in general, no, I've never heard of that. Yeah, there you go.
So there's another question about which dead or declining trees are a fall risk and should be removed near structures versus left as a snag. Are there ways you can visually tell so beneficial snags are not unnecessarily removed? I'll jump in here first and say that any tree that's dead should be considered a hazard, a safety hazard if it's around structures.
Right.
And one of the things that you can do is removing trees doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. You can leave the bottom 10, 12 feet as a short snag for wildlife. And Ken, why don't you talk about
Yeah.
short snags and their functions?
Yeah, so one way to do it is I call it hazard to habitat. So if the tree is considered a hazard, to, like Kevin said, infrastructure, house, a driveway, a daycare center, you can take like essentially 2/3 or 3/4 of the height out of it, get the weight out of the top, and turn it into essentially a woody cylinder like this one that's on the screen right now, and they'll stand for years and years and years. I mean, they won't in general tip over, they'll rot in place, but if it's far enough away from your infrastructure, then you get the pleasure of looking at the base of that tree, and you'll get the habitat value. So yeah, and consult an arborist, and when you speak to the arborist, ask about making a habitat tree, and almost all of them have done it. They're like, yeah, okay, sure, I can top it, and have them shorten it to the height you're comfortable with, take their saw and just make it look like it broke, and all of a sudden you've got this marvelous habitat feature that's right there.
Okay, we'll do one more.
Okay.
Do woodpeckers mate for life or extended periods, or is this a yearly chore to find a mate?
I think most woodpeckers are relatively long-lived, like pileatids can live 10, 15 years. And I think they find a territory, they will tend to mate with the same partner if they still survive. But realize wildlife has a pretty tough go of it, and many animals don't survive more than one or a couple of years. Some of them move around on the landscape when their territory breaks down. So yes and no. They do mate for extended periods, particularly through courtship and breeding. So through courtship and breeding, the cool thing with woodpeckers is they both actually brood the young. And so they will roost in that cavity. By the way, Kevin, this is a great segue. And they will use that hole sometimes year round. Pileatids don't migrate, and they've been found to roost in the same cavities that they nested in. So I'm going to keep going, Kevin. This is a great segue. May I?
Yes, please.
Okay, so these primary cavity excavators, the woodpeckers, which, in gathering from the questions, yes, they are really cool birds. They make a new cavity every year. They won't use a nest box because they just have to do it. They got to do it themselves, and they will uh, use that chisel. They have a combination chisel and tweezer on their beak, where they'll pound a hole into a tree that's been dead long enough to get soft enough that they can dig it. And they'll chop, chop, chip, chip, chip. They grab it, they fling it out. This is Greg Thompson's marvelous photographs here. They cry, and this is a mystery to me. How do they manage to chisel the wood out of the inside of the cavity so that they can create, and I'll show you one here in a second, create this kind of gourd-shaped internal thing in the tree so that they can do this and they can raise their young. A woodpecker nest, a cavity, is a great place to raise a family. There's one door, there's only one way for a predator to get in and out. One or the other of the parents is generally either inside or close by all the time, and they have a really high fledging rate. So it's a marvelous adaptation to nesting safety and to cover, roost cover. So it's a great place to raise a family. Good cavity snags that woodpeckers can excavate easily often are broken off. They're of a larger diameter. They get softer. They have more wood to work with. And like this one right here, sometimes when you see a cool snag like this in the forest, there'll be 1, 2, 3, 4. This one had like 6 more cavities on the back of it. So sometimes they'll have multiple cavities. This is a larch, which are particularly good because the sapwood stays hard with the middle getting soft. And this tree has been standing for, oh gosh, the landowner had never not known it being there. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There's 15 visible cavities on that side of that tree. There's a nice flicker hole right there. There's a classic, beautiful ponderosa pine. Here's one from the Olympic Peninsula that's an old cedar, spruce that's been there for probably 100 years. So there you go. Marion, that is just such a good question. Um, uh, she asks, are the abandoned cavities used by other animals? Well, by golly, they are very, very much. So a woodpecker will make or clean out a cavity every year as a matter of normal nesting and courtship behavior. So they'll go find another tree, make another hole, clean one out. And then when they're done, they do it again. Well, those abandoned cavities are prime real estate. They're sought after by many species, including some classics, bluebirds, swallows. And I'm going to brag here a little bit. That bluebird right there, Kevin, check this out. I took that picture yesterday with my phone on a spotting scope. Isn't that amazing? That's a mountain bluebird, and this is a tree swallow, both nesting on our place here. There's a kestrel from Greg Thompson, another cavity species. And none of these birds right here can make a cavity. All of these animals like to go inside of a tree for nesting and for cover, chickadees, swallows, wrens, brown creepers, little owls, all of the little owls, like the saw-whet here on the right, the pygmy owl, they nest inside of cavities or in a broken top tree or a mistletoe clump or something that they can get inside of. And how about that guy? How about that screech owl in a cavity in a cottonwood? Thanks, Contron, for that photo. Cavity nesting ducks, wood ducks, hooded mergansers, goldeneye, mammals like flying squirrels, Douglas squirrels, pine marten, bats. These are animals that also would go into an abandoned woodpecker cavity. It's pretty amazing. The log falls over, boom, now it's down on the forest floor. Small mammals go down underneath of it. Salamanders can live in the cracks in the log. Lots of things will use a down log, including reptiles and amphibians in pretty large numbers. A ruffed grouse would stand up on the log and I just heard one the other day. It was pretty cool, doing their drumming. So there's a whole different associated fauna with down logs, including amphibians, which I mentioned. And I love this because I pulled that bark back on a field trip showing people the beetle galleries. And here's this tree frog, chorus frog, underneath of the bark where it was moist. So a down log lasts a long, long time. You start looking at them and you think of the time frame. So that one probably has been down within 5 years. That one's been down 60, 70 years. That one was at the Quinault Forest, and there was a little interpretive sign right there saying what they thought that one was. So 150 years, and it's got bloody hemlock trees growing out of it. I love this example. This is over by Moclips. Everybody know where Moclips is? Nod your head if you do. Moclips is out on the southwestern corner of the Olympic Peninsula. And you might guess it's wet. It's like really wet. We happen to hit a sunny day, and this nice lady, she's like, you got to see my stump. This is about a 9 foot across, 9 to 10 foot across cedar stump. And laying next to it was this. This was the butt log. Tree was cut probably during like World War I when they were trying to gather um, spruce to build airplanes and stuff. And so we know when that log was cut. Well, shoot, that's 100 years ago in one of the wettest places in the Pacific Northwest, and it's still intact. It's pretty much still intact. So when you see dead wood out in the forest, just kind of consider the whole dynamic of how it became to be where it was. So, if you have something, say like a freshly knocked over stump, and you want something to use it, the best thing you can do is leave it there and let it soften up. If you deliberately put holes in it and things, you won't necessarily hasten that process. And I'm saying that for Hillary. So yeah, there you go. And then, down in the duff, have you ever done this? Have you ever tore apart that wood that's breaking down at the bottom and started to kind of look around in it? If you're really lucky, you might blunder into a northwestern salamander like that one. And all of the different organisms in there, a lot of funky insects like a springtail or a termite or a millipede, or maybe an ensatina guarding its eggs. That is a totally cool old photo from a slide. Then the whole thing with fungus. I mean, fungus essentially rules the forest out here because it's breaking apart this wood that's breaking down. I binged an image, sorry, I'm gonna take a moment here, of let's see, what I searched on organisms in forest duff, and this picture on the right came up. And I clicked on it, and the title was Ken Beva's Duff. It's like, huh? So Kevin, I put that photo in one of the WSU Forest Stewardship Notes articles, and Bing picked it up. So if you ever put anything out there in public domain, beware. You don't know where it'll show up, but there it is. So yeah, it's so the fungal mycelium, breaking down the wood and everything. The mushrooms as the fruiting bodies of the mycelium. So there's a lot going on down there as the wood rots away, and it feeds the soil. And because it feeds the soil, it feeds everything. All the way from slugs to mushrooms to me and you. And yeah, that's right. Rhea says I should get royalties. I'm getting them right now. There we go. So deadwood associated species. This is kind of one of my punchlines. It's like 38% of the vertebrate organisms in the forest are somehow dependent on deadwood. And here's just a partial list of them, pileated woodpeckers, flying squirrels, nuthatch, tree voles, creepers, wood rats, deer mouse. Somewhere in their life cycle, they're using deadwood substantially in order to help them exist. And so it's one reason that I focus on this so much in my work with landowners, because it's one way you can really boost the presence of native wildlife on your land. So this whole list, it's pretty amazing. I love this quote. Yes, such trees are dead, true enough, but theirs is a lively death indeed. And it has to do with the resilience of wood and how long it takes for wood to break down. This ponderosa pine tree broke off. Oh gosh, there's the top. So it got rot in the middle of it. Boom, probably, I'm going to guess 25, 35 years ago. The pileators are feeding on it. The woodpecker, and there's probably a wren nesting, and it's pretty cool. And so there you go. So aren't there plenty of them out there? I used to work in permit review, and I'd hear this like, oh yeah, they're over there. It's like, they're over there. Just kind of push it. Well, they're not over there. I'm sorry, because the landscape has been pretty much entirely transformed in the lowlands where our small landowners are through timber harvest, farming, conversion at some point in time. And we still persist in this type of harvest. Like, look at all the little tops of the trees laying around. We'll make a slash pile right here, not a snag in sight. Even look at the stand over there. There's one right there. So we clean it up, and it's easier to plant trees when we grow another crop, which is all laudable. It all works and everything's. But, and hazard tree, we alluded to this. We're scared of trees. This was in a hardly ever used picnic area over in Pend Oreille County. The closest picnic table was 200 feet from this tree. Look at it, it's hollow. It was full of woodpecker holes. and they cut it down because they were afraid that on the one day for the 5 seconds when it fell over, it was going to land on a toddler. And it's like, okay, so hazard tree removal is very, very common. And we gather them for firewood. How many of us, raise your hand, I'm raising mine, have ever gone out and cut down some great big dead tree because we thought it was a waste or we wanted the firewood? Yeah, we all do it. And so, um, yeah, that's just something to think about because we in general remove them from the landscape. So it's like, okay, all right, Ken, so I get that. Yeah, well, these things are good habitats, but how many do we need? You know, how many are we supposed to have out there? And I went back and revisited some of the guidelines um, about numbers, and it varies a lot. And part of that comes out of which species are you talking about. It's really complicated, but in general, the larger the snag, provide for more species. In general, if you have a larger tree, uh, there's more niche opportunity in there. And so like a pileated woodpecker has to have a tree at least 20 inches in diameter in order to get that great big nest cavity in the thing. And the tree has to be, soft enough to be just right, or a heart rotted cedar or something. A soft snag, like a grand fir, let's say, would be really good for a downy woodpecker, but who could not use a hard ponderosa pine, for example. Uh, so yeah, so there you go. So how many do you need? Well, it's complicated. And I go back for a moment. It ranges somewhere between 2 and 16 per acre, depending on the species, depending on the diameter. So it's a tough question. So here's one nod is that the forest practices rules in Washington require the retention of wildlife trees at a rate of 2 per acre. And they have to, quote, provide habitat for cavity nesting species. That's a rather broad statement right there. It's really hard to enforce. In general, it's like if you had a 20-acre harvest, you got to leave 40 trees. And if you have a riparian buffer on the edge, it's really easy to get that count. So it's really hard to enforce the intent. And safety always takes precedence. So in general, most timber harvests, they just cut them because they don't want to take a chance on worker safety. So there it is in regard to the rules. So this is what I say. This is where I've come around to, and I've been doing this for a long time, 30 years or so. Try for 4 to the acre as a target. And I would say 2 hard ones and 2 soft ones. And that's like double the recommendation. That's more than the minimums. And the best strategy is to know what a good one looks like, and keep those around every chance you have. A good one. Well, what is a good one? Well, a good one is bigger is better. I mean, I'm thinking like, let's call it 10 inches as a cutoff. Broken tops are great because once the top breaks, then the rot trajectory can go down through the stem and the stem will soften from the top, and then the cavities and the bark will slough off and everything. Any species, frankly, somebody was asking about that over there, is okay. They all work, but some are better than others. Let's see, how do I go? There it is. So the best ones would probably be a cedar, a Douglas fir, a ponderosa pine. Grand fir is okay. Hardwoods are actually pretty good. I saw somebody asked about killing alder trees. Yes, 10 inches ray is the diameter of the trunk. Yes. So deciduous trees, hardwoods, sorry, I hate to misuse that word, are the best ones when they're big and maybe partially alive, like an alder tree that's starting to go into decadence would be a good choice. So they do get used. They don't stand quite as long, although big leaf maples can stand for a long time after they're dead. But any of those are good, and frankly, because the dynamic of the forest, because we're usually in an earlier successional stage, shoot, we'll take what we can get. So if you don't have any, create some, hire an arborist, tell them how high to knock the top out of the thing. And if you know any arborists, they're usually kind of like mad scientist artists, and they will happily make you a habitat tree. You can girdle them. Somebody asked about girdling. Oh, C.W. Linda is a cottonwood, sorry. Um, and so like this tree right here was girdled at the bottom, and that was like 7 years ago, no, 5 years ago at Ken Miller's place. And sure enough, that's a really nice little snag right now. So girdling's one way you can do it. If you were really ambitious, you could girdle the top with a climber. And if you're doing a harvest and you're using one of these machines, um, have them make some snags, 2 per acre. Go out and see if you have any. But particularly, and this is one of my comments, if you tell the logger, if it's got butt defect, a scar, a crook, shoot, snip that sucker off. Make it part of the contract. Tell them you have to do it. 8 foot minimum. And also these masticators work. So here, watch this. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010, 1011, 1012, 1013, 1014, 1015 seconds, and he just made an 8 foot high snag. And I taught a loggers class one time, and I was pitching this point, and I said, does anybody do this? And this guy goes, yeah. And I chatted with him after, so I need a video. So he sent me a video, and there's what kind of shoes he was wearing that day. And so I really like that because it works. It's pretty cool. In fuels reduction treatments, these masticators, you can do the same thing. Oh, but do it yourself. This is a picture from Kevin's backyard. Was that you or Brendan? I can't remember which one of you guys that was. So yeah, don't do that yourself. It does work too. This was at Suncadia of all places, over by Roslyn, and when they laid out that development, they made a bunch of wildlife trees with the falling machines. And you go there today, and they're full of cavities. It's just so cool in regard. Okay, I'm almost done. So here's my story. So I live in the Metro Valley, and my wife and I have 15 acres that looked like this before the year 2014. So basically a scattered ponderosa pine stand. And this is a deep, complicated story. I could give you lots of different angles on it. And we're both bird watchers. And here's some of the species that lived in these scattered ponderosa pine trees. Nuthatches, even grosbeaks, seed eaters, Clark's nutcrackers. We had some Douglas squirrels. Not that many woodpeckers, because we only had one snag in our probably, let's call it 8 acres of forest right here. Well, had something pretty exciting happen on August 1st, 2014. A fire started, part of the Carlton complex, burned through here in an hour and a half. It went 2 miles, burned down 10 houses, all that bitter brush in that last picture. This was a hot ground fire. I had not pruned my trees. I did bad. I was a bad landowner, and they all died. All these trees died, every single one of them. And look at that, all that vegetation is gone. There she is with the dogs walking around. They saved our house. Firefighters saved our house, whole other thing. But check this out. This picture was taken yesterday. So that other one was taken from right up there, looking down to this direction. And now going around, these are the species here. Kestrels, hairy woodpecker, Lewis's woodpecker, flickers, bluebirds, tree swallows, violet green swallows, pygmy nuthatch. Check out this tree. So I had the arborist top this tree so that it would last longer. And in the top of it, there's a kestrel nest. In the middle of it, there's a flicker nest. Down at the bottom, there's a bluebird nest. That's in one tree, in that one tree. And I took that picture yesterday. It is just so cool what has happened. And the shrubs are growing back. Look at the shrub layer here. So it's just such a marvelous irony that I've been obsessed with snags my entire career. And now the snag guy owns a snag patch. So there you go. Hopefully somebody appreciates that. Sophie asks, how does topping make it last longer? There's less weight in the top of the tree, so it's less likely to topple in the wind. So look at what happened. The natural dynamic here, a whole bunch of them have broken off. The Lewis's woodpeckers are in that one right there. Yep, yeah, and that's exactly why. There you go. Okay, so almost done. Here's a couple take homes for you. That deadwood is vitally important to forest ecosystems. about a third of the forest species. I said half, but it's like 38%. So, 40%, it's a lot. And it can be provided for in management, but it has to be consciously addressed. It has to be something that it's like, one of my objectives is to provide dead wood. And they're beautiful and they're full of life. They're not ugly. That's something we have to push against is this aesthetic of tidy landscape, because a healthy forest includes dead wood. We talk a lot about forest health these days. That's a healthy forest right there. Trees spaced out just right, nice good crown, a nice snag right here. So, it's just a really, really cool element of the forest, something we can think about, something we can appreciate. Thank these folks for the photos. Uh, yeah, and then that Bing guy. And thank you to the WSU team and to the DNR Forest Stewardship Group. Maybe we'll see you next week, or it's week after next. I can't remember when my next one is, but I'm doing animal damage and then enhancements. I've got 2 more of these. We're going to do this again tonight at 7 o'clock. There's my email address. Please feel free to send me pictures, questions, all those things. And there is a pileated woodpecker, and there's my best bluebird from yesterday. So look at that, Kevin. I am 1 minute over, baby. So thank you.
All right, very good. For people who are at the end of your lunch break and need to get back to it, of course, go ahead. We are continuing to record here through the Q&A session, and you'll get that link in the next day or two, along with a PDF handout of Ken's slides and a transcript of the chat dialogue here. So you'll get everything. A couple questions that I'll give answers to here before I turn over some wildlife questions to Ken. One question is where is there a more in-depth class on this sort of thing? And the answer is that we do an 8 to 9 week short course called Forest Stewardship Coach Planning. And we do that several times a year. This year it's all online because of the whole virus thingy. So we'll be doing 2 of those classes this fall. If you're on our newsletter list, you'll get announcements of that. So make sure you get on our newsletter list. But that's a comprehensive class about all things related to forest stewardship, and where we blend together forest health, wildlife, fire, along with silvicultural techniques, soils management, and so forth. So you might be interested in that. The other question that came up that I really related to is how do you convince people that snags aren't ugly? And it's such a great question. And that's one of the things that we try to do through education, is to talk to people about function, and that nature is inherently messy, and it's the mess that provides for biodiversity. And so I encourage people to recalibrate their idea of beauty in nature so that you can see the beauty in what seems like a chaotic mess, but is still highly functional.
So Kevin, can I answer one here?
Yes, please.
Somebody asked when my album is out, and it is out. I have a website if you want to check it out.
Why don't you send me that and I can get it out through the follow-up email.
Cool.
Okay,
And I'll expand a little bit. We had a couple questions about fire and fire risk around the snags. As I typed into the chat, first of all, fire is a great reason, one of the many reasons not to have a standing snag within falling distance of your house. If it's near to your house, cut it down so that it can't hit your house, because the only thing worse than a tree falling on your house is a burning tree falling on your house. But in general, when you're talking about fire risk and worried about fuels around wildfires, what you're really worried about are those fine fuels, usually about 1.5 inches in diameter and under. And those are the fuels that burn quickly and drive the intensity of a fire front. And those larger fuels, well, they will catch fire and smolder and burn slowly and sometimes smolder on for weeks after the fire. They're not actually burning intensely as that fire front moves through, and they're not driving the dynamics of that fire front. So if you have a standing dead snag, pretty much as soon as all of your foliage and fine twigs drop off of it, your wildfire risk reduces down below what it was when that was a living tree. There were quite a few studies done around areas where mountain pine beetles were causing mass mortality in the mountains over the whole Intermountain West, and looking at the fire risk in those areas where acres and thousands of acres of trees were dying at once. And you see this really sharp increase in fire risk in the sort of immediate year and a half after the mortality takes place, when you still have those dry needles on the tree. But then after that, as soon as all those fine fuels drop off, the fire risk actually went down and went below what it was prior to the beetle mortality.
Hey,
Yeah,
Brendan, can I add something to that?
yeah,
Okay, I just flipped back to this slide. Look at the picture on the right. And
yeah,
what we've been doing is actually piling some of the finer fuels. And now these are not a fire hazard. The downwood and the grass is a fire hazard. But
yeah.
as long as it's up overhead, that's not a fire hazard.
I mean, and you can see right there, it didn't burn. There was a big fire and it didn't burn.
Right. And look what happened back here. That the worst fuels in that picture are those green needles on the pines, and the mistake here was these ladder fuels right here, and it went right up, and that tree right there died. Every one of those trees died, and look how spaced out they are, and that was because of the amount of fuel below, and it got rolling and it cooked the trees. These trees were scorched up 50 feet high and then crowned out and died. No, they didn't all crown out. I'm sorry. See those 3 trees right? Those 4 trees right there are those 4 trees right there. That's the same trees right there.
Oh, wow.
And look at that. They did not crown out, but they scorched to about here, and all those lower branches burned, and it cooked the cambium. So, yeah, I honestly was surprised looking at this much scorch. I thought a bunch of these trees would survive, but none of them did. Yep. So anyway.
Okay, here's a good question. I have a tree trunk on my property about 3 feet tall. What can I do to encourage wildlife to find and nest in it? I have seen cavity holes in
Yep.
3 foot tall stuff, but Ken, is there any way to, I don't know, put a neon sign for woodpeckers saying vacancy on it?
You could attempt to carve a cavity in the side of it or put a box on it. Yeah, wait, I mean, it's got to decay. It needs some cracks in it for something to get into. So you could do some, manipulation like that, but mostly just give it some time.
And we've had several questions about hardwood versus conifer snags and relative values, and do cavity nesting critters use hardwoods like alder?
Yes, they definitely do, particularly when they get a little bit more diameter. Alder is an interesting case because it grows really fast. I mean, in 8 years, it can be 6 inches in diameter. In 35 years, it's 12 inches in diameter. And one problem for cavity excavators with those trees is because the wood is relatively soft, if they die when they're 10 inches in diameter, the roots rot at the same rate or faster than the stem, and they often tip over before they have been standing long enough to have something excavate them, but they will. And particularly downy woodpeckers and nuthatches, chickadees, they will use even small diameter stems if they're soft enough. So, I finally have kind of come to the conclusion, it's like, we use what we got. I mean, cottonwoods are surprisingly good because they'll have a thick bark that will stay intact, the wood softens up and you'll find cavities through the bark where the cavity is just right inside of the sapwood, only in the outside 2 inches. It'll be 6 inches down and there'll be a little hole made by a downy woodpecker or a nuthatch or even a chickadee will pick their way through it. So they have value. It's like work with what you got. The conifers will last longer, but work with what you got.
Okay, here's an interesting question. Which species are best for creating snags? Are there some particularly good species? And I know the answer is going to be it depends to some degree, but what are your thoughts?
I think let's see, I did mention that. It kind of went by fast. Here you go. Best are cedars are really good. Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, grand firs are okay. Cottonwood, I meant here, hardwoods are best when they're big and partially alive because they last longer. The roots are hanging on. So cottonwood, alder, big leaf maple. It's an interesting thing that among arborists, topping a tree is considered really bad form. And that's because in an aesthetic, and we've all seen them where somebody went and just whacked the top out of a tree and then it sprouts back in this jumble of branches in response to that. But sometimes those very trees will get heart rot and they become these really good wildlife trees. So one good technique with a hardwood is to leave some live branches and take all the branches off and create a spiked top. But you got to climb up there and do this. And then the top becomes a snag and the tree's still alive. So there's some tricky ways to do it. Yeah, and so the best ones are generally the same trees that are the best for timber. The only one that really is not of much value, interestingly, is lodgepole pine because it doesn't get soft. It stays hard unless it's a really big lodgepole. You don't see cavities in lodgepole hardly ever. So yeah, and so what is a really good thing to do is find a local arborist that has an interest in wildlife trees, and you can work with them. Let's see. Here's a question about a pileated box. Sorry, Kevin, I jumped right on you there.
No, go ahead.
So woodpeckers generally don't use boxes, and it's because somebody described them as being like the do-it-yourselfer he's got to build his own stuff. He won't go to Home Depot. He's got to build his own whatever, and they just have to. They won't. In general, they don't use boxes. So if you want woodpeckers, you got to give them something to bang on. Yep. Okay, go ahead. In general. Okay, you're on, Kevin.
Okay, there's a question about when we're talking about diameter, or we talk about the diameter of the trunk. Yes, if we talk about a tree's diameter, we're actually talking about something called diameter at breast height, and that's a standard place to measure the diameter of the stem of the tree, which is defined as 4.5 feet above ground on the uphill side of the tree. So that's our standard diameter measuring spot. Let's see here. A question, logger class, is that similar to rigging? Not sure what that's referring to, so if you can clarify that for us. Let's see here. Some additional questions on bark beetles. We talked about pine beetles a little bit in the chat. Then there's a question about Doug fir beetles.
May I say something about beetles?
Yes, please.
So most of the issues with beetles and dead trees are early on, and it's pine. So somebody was saying something about ponderosa pine beetle. Yeah, green pine slash can actually create an extra in plural life generations of something called the Ips beetle. And in general, that's the only, to my understanding, slash that like creates a problem for the existing tree. So the beetle, deadwood isn't, once a tree has been dead and it's standing there decaying, all the bad bugs are pretty much gone. The rest of it is all engaged in breaking the tree down, in wood boring and chewing it up and all of that. And so the cambium beetles are a whole one class of insects associated with dead trees.
Okay, and then as far as Doug fir beetle goes, can you take those down and pilot throughout the year without risk? Doug fir beetles do get into felled Douglas fir. That's what they like. They like freshly killed Douglas fir. If you have a lot of it, and by a lot of it we mean like more than 4 per acre that you either fell yourself or go down in a storm in a given season that are greater than 9 inches in diameter, that can attract a lot of beetles when they fly the following spring, which then can build up in that excess larger diameter Doug fir slash to epidemic populations that then when those fly as adults the following spring, can jump to live healthy trees. That's why we tell folks that if you have some downed Douglas fir of large diameter, you want to clean that up before 2 springs pass, because it's going to be that second spring where you might see an epidemic population build up. And in any case where you're talking about Doug fir beetle, mountain pine beetle, ips, if you have you cut things up into firewood or you pile some slash somewhere, don't do it next to a live tree. That's just asking for trouble there.
So Gary, here's one for Gary, asked about a wildlife tree sign. I have a few, and that one that I had the picture of in there, I used to have a whole bunch of them and I gave them all away. And Gary, that's a good idea. I actually, Brendan, let's make a new generation of those things. And Gary, send me an email and we'll get you a couple of them. That's a good idea. I've talked about doing that for a long time for landowners just like you. Yes.
We missed Nancy's question at the very beginning. She was saying she was specifically interested in whether or not she should keep dead Indian plums, small willows, etc., or cut them back and let the new growth come up. So what about small, fine dead wood?
So Nancy, are you in an area?
She's on Vashon.
Oh, okay. I think that I know exactly the stuff you mean, like where the shrub gets tall and then it often gets shaded out and then there's that dead wood in there. It's not really hurting anything. That's almost one of those aesthetic questions. And this is a nice wraparound to how do you convince somebody that they're not ugly? I mean, I have one of my neighbors who just despises the dead trees. And so every time I see him, and this, Nancy, I'm digressing here, but every time I see him, I go, oh, you should have seen the nesting kestrels over there. And there's bluebirds now. Oh, it's so wonderful. And it kind of, it's a campaign of love, you just have to keep saying it. In regard to the twiggy stuff, it's kind of up to you. Birds obviously use it as perches. I've found with some of those shrubby species, and this I can't really entirely speak to, but when they're cut back, they sprout again. And it's pretty amazing because sometimes in fuels reduction projects, they'll like masticate or chew up, the serviceberry, and sort of like where they burned here on our hill. And 5 years later, they're 5 feet high. So, Nancy, I think the twiggy deadwood has some value for like downy woodpeckers, but once it dries out and it's really hard, I'm not sure there's a lot of insect activity there. So it becomes an aesthetic and fire risk question for you on the twiggy stuff. And I know the answer to Ray's question there. Shall I just answer Ray right here, Kevin?
Please do.
Ray asked about a logger class. I actually do training for the Washington Contract Loggers Association, where they get accreditation, or they get credits for the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, et cetera. And I get 50 minutes to talk to loggers about this thing. And I'm always pitching, making snips. And every now and then they do, and I ask them, I say, how many of you do that? And there'll be 3 guys raise their hand, and one day I said, I need a video, and this guy sent me one, and I use it. I wish I could remember his name because I would credit him, but yeah, so that was it.
And that answers another question that came up is what was the term for trimming out the top of the tree there? Snipping.
I call it snip, you
Yep.
know, yeah. I like to call them snips. Yep. And if you're ever driving on Interstate 90 past Roslyn, so, where it says Suncadia, just go the 2 miles off the freeway and drive in the front of Suncadia. And right by the fancy front sign, there's 3 of those wildlife trees that were made in the year 2000. And there they are. They're right next to the road, and they've all got woodpecker cavities in them. I just think that's so cool. So yeah, it works.
Here's a good question. Do you recommend spacing trees in a forest with mostly dug fir, cedar, and hemlock that is fairly dense? Yes. Definitely yes. And we're going to be doing one next week on forest health issues.
Yep.
And so I would encourage you to tune in on that, where we talk about why spacing is so important and how that plays into forest health and such. How wide you space is going to depend on your objectives. If in general, I would say that we use something called the D+ rule, where you take the diameter in inches and then you add a constant, usually somewhere between 4 and 10, depending on how shade tolerant the species is, and then that's your desired average spacing in feet. And remember, it's average. It's okay if you have clumps of trees and some are spread further apart. So I think as a middle of the road guide, shoot maybe for D+5 in general. So if you have on average 12-inch diameter trees, you'd want a spacing on average of about 17 feet. If you are interested in attracting wildlife and you want to encourage a lot of that brush species to come in, and Ken talked about that last week, then you can space even wider, and that will introduce a lot more sunlight to the forest floor, which will bring back a lot of those wildlife friendly understory species. But be careful, because that also encourages the invasive species to come in there as well. So you probably want to have a plan for dealing with that. Ken, add to that for me, would you?
No, yes. And so Kevin makes a really good point that a healthy forest is also one that doesn't have excessive mortality from crowding. I mean, there is such a thing as the ideal forest would be a mix of live trees and dead trees with a couple over there and a couple over there. What we don't want are complete mortality events from drought, bark beetles, fire. And so, yes, spacing the trees out appropriately is absolutely important. And while you're doing that, you keep an eye on logs and a snag here, 2 here. And that's why I say, 2 to 4 snags to the acre. Do it on purpose, space your trees out. And one beautiful thing with our work is we get to see stands that people have been manipulating for years, over decades. And it's pretty remarkable what happens when careful, spaced thinning is done, over time, how the stands will respond. Yes, skunks will use the hollow of fallen trees.
Okay, here's a question. If the tree doesn't pose a risk, should you cut it or should you let it break on its own? All comes back to your objectives. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. If you like wildlife, let it break down on its own. If you don't like the aesthetic, nothing wrong with removing it. So really, I think, Ken, that comes down to personal preference, I would think.
Yeah, and if you wanted to hasten cavities, let's say you had a stand of solid, Douglas fir. Let's say you had a 50-year-old stand of 14-inch Douglas fir trees that had been manipulated, and you go out there, and I've seen a lot of these. There's really no cavity trees, because one thing about cavity trees is you can see them. I think this is a totally interesting thing. You go out in your stand, I mean, they don't move, and so like those ones that I showed pictures of with the holes in them, hell, there's one, you can see it. Oh, there's one over there, and start looking for them. And in many, many stands, they're not there. So if you wanted to hasten the presence of that habitat feature, you actually might choose to go and top a couple of them back in the forest. I mean, if you were hiring a climber, it would cost you. But I mean, just to my anecdote about our property here, these pines, I go back to them here for a second, have been breaking off faster than I thought they would. These are all ponderosa pines, and this is only 6 years since the fire, and we've had a couple of significant wind events, but like this one I'm pointing at back here, that's what I thought they would all look like. And I now have 52, I'm a science guy, I've counted them, topped pine trees. And the topped ones that have either broken or I had the climber do 14 trees, they're all still standing. No, one fell over, but they're pretty much all still standing. And this surprised me. And all of the cavities, not all, almost all of the cavities are in the broken off tree. Like that one right there is where the Lewis's woodpecker are. And there's a one cavity mid stem on this one, I believe. So you could hasten that habitat feature by, doing this to some trees back in the forest, but that's up to you. Yeah.
Okay, here's a great question. Maybe you answered this already when I wasn't paying attention. But where can you get those cool yellow wildlife tree signs?
You know what? Ray is going to send me an email and remind me, and I am going to order a set of them and then send him some because I've been wanting to do that anyway. How many you need, Ray? You tell me in your email. There's my email address right there, and we'll make it so because we have one version anyway that through the farm forestry, but I want to make some. So so we're going to do that.
And can you give me at some point, give me a link to tell me where I might be able to procure some as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin will order them together and you can have some.
There we go. Okay. On through here. Here's an important question that we probably should have answered much earlier. What is slash? And slash is a downed material on the forest floor. So trees that go over in a storm would be slash, or all the debris and tops and everything left over after logging would be considered slash.
Hey, so the song actually sounded okay like that. That's what I picked up on. That's a question. Back to
I'm sorry, once again?
did the song sound okay? The way that I laid the microphone?
Yeah, I could hear it fine.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks, David.
It always sounds a little tinny over these microphones, but that's just the nature of the technology.
Yeah, Cynthia saw Sasquatch in the list. Good job, Cynthia. I always that in a live presentation, somebody will laugh. Yeah, there you go. Kit Ellis has the sign. Hi, Kit. That I was thinking of. Yes. There you go. Yes, and Kit Ellis is one of our wonderful forest landowners. Kit, I want to come see your place again. So let's make that so.
And then Ria asks about the class that will talk about tree spacing and so forth. So in the follow-up email that I'll send out to all participants, it'll have a link to where you can see all of our next upcoming webinars. And if you said yes to the newsletter when you registered for this webinar, you'll get put on our list. Otherwise, you can just shoot over to our website, or you can respond to the email that I send out, and I can hook you up.
Mountain beavers.
Mountain beavers, huh?
Did you see that one from Gary?
You could do a whole webinar on mountain beavers.
Oh, you mean like animal damage?
Yeah.
Hey Gary, I'm going to do a a webinar on animal damage in a couple weeks, and we'll talk about mountain beavers. But Gary asks if they potentially harm trees with their burrows. They mostly harm little trees because they snip them off. And so I've never heard of concern about, what's the word? Call them adult trees being injured by mountain beavers, because they basically create a burrow system down in the ground and then come out and eat succulent vegetation. So so there. Kevin, did that cover mountain beavers?
Yeah, I think I got all the questions. If I missed you, please type something real quick in the chat box. In fact, if you don't have time to type out your whole question, just type "wait" with an exclamation point, and we'll hold on until you have a chance to type your full question in. So we'll give just a minute here.
Oh, Marion asked about cavity nesting bees. I have heard of and seen like paper wasps using cavities. Feral honeybees will use cavities. Most of the native bees are either to my understanding, would be like mason bees, or actually in the ground or in cracks in the wood. So
That depends what you define as a cavity. Mason bees will use holes, small
yeah,
bee-sized. They'll use bee-sized cavities, but they're not
there
going to
you
use the big cavities.
so the cavities would support bees too. I mean, I was thinking on a smaller scale, any sort of a indentation in a tree is an opportunity for something to get into the wood, because wood is such a marvelous substrate. Okay, Rhonda makes a comment that she felt like the mountain beaver holes made the trees more vulnerable to tipping. That would not surprise me, truthfully. Because mountain beavers make a pretty extensive burrow system down under the ground.
Yeah, they have hugely extensive burrow systems. So I think in certain situations, like that could possibly be a worry.
And they make the trees feel very undermined. Okay.
And they'll eat your rhododendrons too.
And on that note,
what does that mean? XD, XD, XD.
She's laughing. It's closed eyes with a smiley face.
Okay. By the way, language is going to devolve into hieroglyphics. Yes.
Must be cyclical,
That's fun.
What's old is new again.
So
okay.
if y'all need something else to do later today, we're going to do this again tonight, and I promise it'll be different.
Good, different, or or just different? Okay, so I don't see any more questions. Again, we thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed your time with us. We sure enjoyed having you with us, and you're putting up with us here. So Brendan, go ahead and close us out here.